Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, the results are almost in as the United States 2020 presidential race comes to a close. Meanwhile, Israel's airports receive a badly needed upgrade as coronavirus infections continue to rise. And in an historic first, Malawi announces the location of its future Israeli embassy. It's a complete nail-biter of a race. Early morning results showing just a couple key battleground states standing between either Donald Trump or Joe Biden and the White House. Incumbent President Donald Trump having already claimed victory long before all the votes were even counted, even threatening to stop the count at the Supreme Court.
For the good of this nation, this is a very big moment. This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list, okay? It's a very sad moment. To me, this is a very sad moment.
The Biden camp, on the other hand, is vowing to fight such a move, saying that the vote will end with the last ballot and not before.
You know, we could know the results as early as tomorrow morning, but it may take a little longer. As I've said all along, it's not my place or Donald Trump's place to declare who's won this election. That's the decision of the American people. But I'm optimistic about this outcome.
Either way, the atmosphere overnight on both sides of the aisle has been a murky mix of optimism, fear, hope, anger, celebration, and anxiety.
This line for 3 hours. Come out to vote, as I think everybody should do their civic duty. And note to self, don't have a COVID positive result during a presidential election. But they're doing the best they can. So.
Joining us with some details now from the United States is renowned American attorney Alan Dershowitz. Alan, thank you so much for being with us. Now tell us about the feeling in the air over there right now. How do you feel about the division among Americans as well as within the Jewish community?
Well, it's a very divided nation. Family members aren't speaking to each other. It's just going to get worse because it looks like this election will go to the courts and may be decided on a 5-4 vote, with the deciding vote being cast by a justice who was just appointed by one of the litigants, namely President Trump. So it will not ease the divisions of this country. It may decide the election, but we're a deeply, deeply divided country, a deeply divided community. The Jewish community is deeply, deeply divided. The pro-Israel community is less divided, but it is still divided.
You know, do you see any of this blowing over anytime soon? Any of that, social civil war,
No.
You could call it?
It's not a civil war. So far, we've kept the demonstrations largely peaceful. It's somewhat like it is in Israel today. A lot of street demonstrations, a lot of protests, but a relatively small amount of violence. I suspect that will continue. If the case is decided by 5-4 vote and the presidency is decided by 1 vote of a justice newly appointed, that will create a lot of sense of delegitimation of the courts and of the process. But we are a complicated democracy. It's much more complicated than Israel, where you have a parliamentary system. Sure. In our system, we have 3 equal branches of government, and it makes for great complexity when you have a very closely contested election like this one.
Well, so now I understand that you wrote a book after the Bush-Gore election in 2000, particularly about how the Supreme Court held that deciding vote in their hands.
Yeah.
And you're saying now that you see a similar result coming up ahead, but earlier we heard from President Trump saying that he would contest the vote already, telling the Supreme Court to stop counting. What do you make of these comments?
Well, that's what they're going to do. They're going to bring a challenge. If it's a close vote in Pennsylvania and the outcome is determined by late counted mail-in ballots, they will bring a challenge. They already have, and the Supreme Court decided that case 4-4 with equally divided vote. Now you have a ninth justice. So I think we can anticipate a challenge in Pennsylvania. The only way to avoid that challenge is if the result is so overwhelming one way or the other that the number of late counted votes won't affect the outcome. But short of that, we're in court, and we're in court for a month, perhaps even longer. This is perhaps a redo of 2000. And I did write a book about that, Supreme Injustice, where I very bitterly complained about the Supreme Court taking the election away from the people and handing it over to a 5-4 partisan vote by the Supreme Court. That could happen again.
Well, so again, similarly then, do you see this situation as, truly partisan? What do you know about Amy Coney Barrett, the new justice?
She's very able, and but she's a Republican, and she has a view of the Constitution, which is probably similar to the view of the Constitution of the 5 justices that ruled in favor of George W. Bush in 2000. So I think she has several options. One, she could recuse herself from the case, saying, look, I was just appointed, and the appearance of bias is too great. She could vote either way. We just can't predict. She has no record at all in voting cases. She has never decided a voting case. So all we have to go by is the fact that she was appointed by a Republican president and that she generally follows in the footsteps of justices like Scalia, who voted to stop the count in 2000.
All right. Wow. Alan Dershowitz, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And now for more, we turn to Alon Pinkas, former Israeli consul general in New York. Alon, thank you so much for being with us. Now, starting abroad, we've seen reports of the uncertainty over the elections dominating news bulletins all over the world. What does this election mean to the international community?
Well, it means a lot. I mean, unlike previous elections in previous years, where, according to the world, it didn't really matter who gets elected. It could be Bill Clinton or George H.W. Bush. It could be Barack Obama or John McCain. It could be conceivably Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. This time around, it seems that in terms of the international community, there is a huge and profound difference in terms of America's standing in the world and the credibility and reliability of America in the world, depending on who gets elected. I'm not taking sides here, but from an international point of view, obviously the Trump years have not been favorable in terms of international cooperation and multilateral initiatives.
Interesting. All right. And you're coming back to New York now for a second. Do you have any insights into the division, per se, between the Jewish vote in the state, the ultra-Orthodox Jews mainly supporting Donald Trump, whereas the majority of the rest of the Jewish community in America is supporting Biden?
Right. Well, obviously I've seen one exit poll, to be honest, and it showed 77% of American Jews voting for Biden over Trump. And that's consistent with previous presidential election cycles in which Jews voted for the Democrat 70% and above.
So you don't think that this was really necessarily affected by Trump and Trump's alleged division?
No. It was. You're absolutely right. Now, in the last 20 years, and that goes to the heart of your question, in the last 20 years, there's been a division which is primarily manifest in New York, in which the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community, is more inclined to vote for a Republican. They did that, by the way, beginning with Rudy Giuliani as mayor and George Pataki as governor of New York. And then it transcended into presidential elections. But, if you look at New York City, the metropolitan New York City, the numbers stay the same. I mean, it is still around 75-25, 3/4 to a quarter in favor of the Democrat, obviously.
All right. Well, as we mentioned earlier, the vote is very, very close. We're talking about really just a handful of states holding the key to the victory. And this really speaks to the seemingly divided public in the United States. Now, oftentimes, American politics seems to seep into Israel. This election and the Black Lives Matter protests being a good example of that. Do you see the division in America between the public between supporters of the Republicans and the Democrats also being imported to Israel?
Well, it's a good question, but let me take it from a different angle. There is a similarity between the people who support Netanyahu and the people who support Trump in terms of a worldview, value system, and appreciation for certain qualities, while at the same time a total rejection or repudiation of the people who dislike my candidate. I mean, there are a lot of Netanyahu supporters who may not agree 100% with Netanyahu, may not even like how what he is involved with, but they hate his detractors even more.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. Alon Pinkas, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
All right, now, meanwhile, back in Israel this morning, IDF troops reportedly neutralized a Palestinian gunman as the suspect attempted to open fire on the soldiers just south of the city of Nablus. And while the suspected terrorist has been killed, there are no other casualties reported. The attack comes at a very tense time, however, as many Palestinians are threatening clashes pending the results of the United States election. Whether this attack was in any way related is yet to be determined, though. What we do know is that the suspect has since been identified as a captain-ranked member of the Palestinian Authority's security forces, who served in the Preventative Security Unit, similar to Israel's Shin Bet. Now, in terror-related news outside of Israel, ISIS is now officially taking responsibility for the shooting attack in Vienna on Tuesday, in which 4 people were killed and nearly 24 injured. The gunman likewise declaring his allegiance to the terror group after having already served in prison for attempting to join the Islamic State.
Bismillah, نبايع على الخليفة المسلمين أبو إبراهيم الهاشمي القريشي على السمع والطاعة في المنشة والمكره والعسر واليسر.
Joining us with more is former Austrian ambassador to Israel and Cyprus, currently the ambassador to the United States, Martin Weiss. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
Now, what is the situation right now in Vienna? Are people able to leave their homes at all?
Yes. People are able to leave their homes. I mean, the restriction on leaving their home is actually the Corona lockdown that has started yesterday. So at night you have to stay at home. But this terrorist situation seems to be under control. There was one attacker. This was this one person we just saw the video of. He has been shot. Before that, he was able to kill 4 innocent civilians in Austria. So the country is in shock, but people are able to go out and about.
Now, what is Austria's general stance on dealing with terrorism? Are there any official policies or measures that are in place?
Yes, I mean, of course, I mean, we are all in this battle together, and you saw it in the case of this young man. He wanted to join ISIS about 2 years ago, tried to travel to Syria via Turkey. He was arrested. He was transferred to Austria because he has an Austrian citizenship, and he spent more than a year in jail and was then released. And there apparently was, if you will, a mistake because he was still a dangerous man, and we saw his danger play out in the last this night of terror.
All right, now we know that among all of the nations of the world, Israeli leaders like Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Rivlin expressed their solidarity with Austria after the attack. Has there been any coordination or security advice that maybe Austria has accepted from Israel?
I think there is close coordination among the security services. The messages that came from Israel were much appreciated. You have a history where you have experienced terrorism much more often than we do. For Austrians, this comes as a huge shock because this is just something that basically never happens in Vienna. And so this was a terror that we are not used to. We are closely coordinating with Israel, also with the United States, and with, of course, our European partners. This is, again, a battle we are all fighting together.
Of course. And now we also know, again, that this was not necessarily targeting any Jews, but it was just outside of the larger synagogue in Vienna. Is the Jewish community, how are they reacting in Vienna?
Well, it was, as you said, it happened exactly downtown Vienna, right by the Vienna city temple. And in the beginning, it was the fear that it was an attack on the synagogue, which it was not. But why did he start to shoot exactly there? It might have been quite on purpose that he chose this location. It just turned out that the synagogue was closed at that moment, and then he continued shooting people on the street. But who knows what would have happened if the synagogue had been open at the time. I think I heard the chief rabbi of the synagogue talk yesterday, and he said he felt safe. I think Jewish life is thriving and well protected in Austria, but it's really something that targets the whole Austrian economy, the whole Austrian society, and that of course includes the Jewish members of our society.
Now, my final question, you mentioned earlier that the gunman had already had a previous record of trying to join ISIS, and he had spent time in prison, but he actually passed a de-radicalization program. How did he deceive that program, and are there others like him?
Well, that of course is a very good question, because when he was released, there were basically, it was documented that he had changed and he was not a risk anymore. Well, that proved to be deadly wrong. And of course, there will be many questions asked how this could have happened. At the end of the day, you can never look into the soul of a person. But of course, you have to be doubly careful if you have someone who already was radicalized, wanted to join ISIS. I think there will be tough questions will have to be asked.
Ambassador Weiss, thank you very much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Good day.
On another note, recent news may have averted our attention for a little while, but alas, the coronavirus pandemic is still here with us. Israel, for one, now reconsidering moving forwards with its lockdown exit strategy. Israeli businesses anxiously awaiting for Sunday, November 15, when the next stage of Israel's tiered coronavirus exit plan is set to take effect and allow them to reopen. Many shopkeepers, meantime, increasingly taking to the streets in recent days to protest the financial hole that they've been put in, some with little to no assistance. But as has often been said, the government plans to only move forwards with the COVID exit strategy when the infection rate allows. And several top Israeli experts are warning of a plateau in Israel's progress, maybe even the beginning of the next rise in infections. Computational biologist Eran Segal telling Israeli media that the infection rate must fall below 0.8 for stores to reopen, but that the rate now stands at 0.86, up from 0.65 when lockdowns first started easing. And that means that reopening now may not only reverse the nation's overall improvements, but it may do so at a time when the initial effects of first reopening schools has yet to even be seen. Still, focusing on the positive, overnight infections are down dramatically since the start of second lockdowns in October. The new number of active cases in Israel enjoying a net drop of 144 for a total of 9,876. The number of serious patients likewise falling to 376, and the death toll holding overnight at 2,592. Meanwhile, the government's 1 billion shekel job training program is also set to gain legs, with the ministers of finance, welfare, and economy planning to settle their disputes over this week. And then finally, in the latest bid to reopen the skies, Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv has announced that it's now ready to conduct COVID testing at the terminal. The Omega check-to-fly testing and laboratory services on schedule to begin by November 9, allowing both for cheaper and potentially faster COVID testing for Israelis who want to travel abroad, as well as for tourists from so-called red countries to come to Israel at all. Moving on, data from the Ministry of Finance is now showing some really surprising trends in real estate, especially considering the ongoing pandemic. Joining us now to explain is Skyview real estate expert Eyal Katz. Eyal, it's a pleasure to have you back. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
It's so, tell us what's going on in the market. Did we understand from this data that this change is surprising?
It is surprising. Let's first of all look at that data. We have Israeli public purchased 10,500 apartments only in August. Okay, that's an increase of 23% from this August to the corresponding month last year. 23%, that's a lot.
And I understand that it's actually a 3-year high, that it's a record of the last 3 years.
That's correct. That's 3 years high of August being the most sales.
So why now, especially in this time of the coronavirus when many people are unpaid leave or even out of work?
Minister of Finance Israel Katz reduced property tax from 8% to 5% for investors. That means if I'm buying my second property or my third property, my property tax now is only 5%. That led investors to come back to the market, and I can tell you, Ron, they came back big time.
Seriously?
We can also see that investors starting to put real estate in their investment portfolio.
Interesting. All right, so do you have any, like an example to show us?
On July, I got a phone call from a contractor. He told me he's building a residential tower. He told me, Eyal, I have 25 flats left. Can you help me market them? I told him, no problem, but I'm busy these days. I'm going to call you at September. I give him a phone call at September. He tells me, Eyal, I don't know what happened. I sold all my flats. I don't have one flat for sale.
Must be nice.
Yeah, and that was August when the tax went down to 5%.
So, all right, so what's maybe the safest way to invest right now? And is this, is this the time for the average individual to invest?
Again, that's a tricky question. It looks that way, but we still will need to see in a few months where this market is heading. I can tell you that, I can advise you that get yourself an expert that knows the market, that's going to stand on your side. And I must give a clarification for people that are buying a new apartment from a contractor. You have a sales law that stands to your defense. The law says that you have liability for damage caused in the apartment. Some of the liability of damage is for 7 years if you have a damage in your apartment, and in some cases it can go between 3 to 5 years. I can put on the Facebook afterwards a link to that law that people can go and look it up. But if you're buying a new apartment from a contractor, know that the law stands beside you in that case.
Eyal Katz, Skyview Real Estate, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In other news, now looking for real estate in Jerusalem is the nation of Malawi. In a visit with his Israeli counterpart on Tuesday, Malawi Foreign Minister Eisenhower Makaka announcing that they will be establishing their embassy in Israel's capital before summer. Hannah Rifkin with the details.
Very exciting. This is a really historic visit. In the meeting that we just had, the minister gave me a message from Malawi President Chekawa. The Malawi president said has decided to open an embassy in Israel and establish it in Jerusalem.
Keeping its promises from earlier this year, President Chakwera of Malawi is officially opening a mission in Jerusalem, slated for completion by summer 2021. And this makes Malawi the first African nation to establish a mission in Israel's capital city. Malawi Foreign Minister Makaka calling the move a bold and significant step in his conference with Israeli Foreign Minister Ashkenazi, and adding that it's the start of a new era in the region, especially given other recent agreements.
We did also congratulate you on the historic peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, known as the Abraham Accord.
Now, though this is Malawi's first embassy in Israel, the two nations have had full diplomatic relations since 1964, with Malawi being one of the few African nations to ignore pressures to cut ties. And the nation hopes that this new move leads to increased cooperation, trade relations, and other assistance.
Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. We had a pretty rainy start to the day here in Israel, and tonight the rain should continue, along with lows averaging 64 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 18 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect more partly cloudy and rainy skies overhead, with highs dropping to an average of 71 degrees Fahrenheit, or 22 Celsius. And now before we go, of course, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. I see we're, already making a mess. Oh, that shared look at the camera, though. Aw. I can't tell who's taking this more seriously. That's how you make the best of a bad situation. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.42 shekels to the American dollar and 2.58 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.